Hello, Adrian here. So in the last series, we opened up very briefly an asset manager for static meshes. And when I say an asset manager, or asset viewer is probably a better way of putting it, it's actually every object that's sort of usable in Unreal. So whether it be images, sound, text, in fact, and geometry, they each have their own editor and viewer. And so if I go into, for instance, let's start out in the starter content. If I open up the architecture tab, which just has a bunch of random bits, sort of walls and stuff, if we open up this one, for instance, we can see both the menu that we looked in before, we'll see the collision that we sort of touched on, but we also see all this other information. And all this information has to do with what happens to this object when it's imported. And we can also add some information onto it that's sort of the default information. So as you'll see, this has a default material. So instead of when we drag it into the viewport, it'll just, or drag it into our model, it'll have no material on it, we can force it to have a starting material. So this is all the stuff that's sort of the defaults of that. So we'll see in here a default material. We can change what that material is if we want to. But more importantly, there's a whole bunch of weird sort of stuff in here that we don't want to engage with at the time being, but it is important to sort of understand that each of these have to do with how Unreal sort of makes the geometry that wasn't originally sort of intended for, or like wasn't in the language that Unreal prefers, and basically rebuilds it to be useful for Unreal. So puts collision, for instance, on it, or allows you to render it properly, and sometimes does sort of mesh reductions and things like that, so it's more efficient. All those kind of things. And so we're able to edit the collision in here as we did before. But we can also edit our transforms, and why this is really useful is that within these transforms we can actually force the we can actually change the transformation information that we originally imported it with. So let's say, for instance, that we imported incorrectly. So let's say that we originally wanted it to be oriented with Y at 45 degrees. So we can change that in here. We can save it. So this saves the object in the content browser. And we'll also notice that it actually changes the preview because we've changed the object, so it actually changes the preview. And when we right-click on that, we can reimport. And reimport is a super useful button because it does two things. The first one is that if you imported this object yourself, it'll actually update that file. So if you save over something you've exported from Rhino, it'll just refresh that file inside Unreal. So you don't actually have to import it again. You can just do reimport and it'll update it. Okay, so for this one, because it's a standard file, it doesn't actually have a place to go for it. But if we were to go, let's say, to our imports before, and we are to click on something and re-import, it'll actually apply, so you'll see here, it's successfully re-imported. It'll apply whatever changes we just did. So if we look at our roof up here, open that guy up, scroll down to its transformation information. That's hard to pronounce. And we will change Y to 45. It won't do anything yet. We have to save it. Let's close that, and we want to re-import. So right-click, re-import. It'll rotate the thing, which is not something we actually want to happen, but just as demonstration, you can see that that is being applied to the object at the content browser level. So that's not actually in its rotation in the bucket of that object. It's in the original object. So be aware that the objects in the content browser have their own orientation. So if you change their orientation, it'll change the relative orientation to all the transforms because they don't know any better. They don't know if that orientation is different. So they're just going to do their own rotation on top of that one. So because we don't want to change that, let's go back and undo that. So we want to open up the asset viewer, go back to that Y, set it to 0, save that, close, and re-import. And that should undo what I just did. And it does. Yay, hurrah. So that's what works with, like, that's how static meshes work. But there's actually viewers for every type of object. So let's open up, for instance, within the starter content we were in earlier. Let's go over to audio, which we opened up before. And if we open up, say, this audio file, it has its own sort of viewer. So because audio doesn't have a visual like representation per se, it doesn't have a preview. So it has all the stuff to do with compression and other things. And these are just all the settings that happen when you import the when you import the audio. So be aware that you can edit things sort of last minute within here. It's not good practice generally, but it is some stuff that you have to do. Like some stuff is necessary because some of this information never shows up, like it isn't in the original file. So you have to put it in yourself. So let's just close it out. Let's close out that viewer, but that gives you a sort of idea of how you can edit things that are, or edit objects that aren't just geometry. And likewise, if we go over to textures, we can have a look at these things we may have taken from Photoshop, open those up, and you can see that this has actually quite a similar interface to Photoshop. You have the checkerboard that shows that it's translucent. It has an alpha channel, it's opaque, so this will be see-through if you use this as a material in itself. And you have all of this other information that happens when it's imported. So you can change the brightness of an object in Unreal if you just want to make a slight adjustment to it and you don't want to open up Photoshop or wherever you got this from originally. And so I can just save and close that out if I made something, if I change something, and you have to make sure to save that after you've edited it as well. And so that's the sort of basics of asset managers. And there's one other thing that we should just go over before we go into, well, our next video, which is on materials and go a little bit more in depth, is that there's a few types of objects that are, I'm going to call sort of the more advanced sort of buckets, which are associating several things that came outside of Unreal. So if we are to open, for instance, a material, let's open up maybe a simple one. Let's pick out, all of these are pretty complex because they're trying to show off the engine, of course. Unreal wants you to buy into their stuff, but let's open up. Okay, this one's not simple, but what you'll see in here is a big mess of wires, which is kind of similar to the material editor in Maya or 3ds Max, or actually a bit like Grasshopper if you've ever used that. And you'll see a whole bunch of stuff that's a bit foreign to you, but we'll not touch this for the time being, but you will see these texture samples. And basically what these texture samples are if you have a look at the details panel, same details panels we've seen all over Unreal, there's a texture in here. And if we just pull this window out so we can actually see our content browser below, it makes it a bit small, so sorry about that, but if we just grab the little magnifying glass wherever it's gone off to, it'll show us where that asset is. So this material is actually pulling assets from all over the place and putting them together to make something. And that's how you sort of, well, when I mentioned in previous videos that there's interactivity you add, there's also association. And so the next video, we're going to go over the basis, the really, really basics of this association. So in the next video, we'll cover materials, and so hopefully we'll see you then. Thanks.
This project was supported by a UTS Widening Participation Strategy, First Year Experience Grant, funded through the Australian Government Higher Education Participation and Partnership Program. The videos were produced by Matthew Austin and Adrian Taylor.